Hello, and welcome to Conquering Finale. My name is Jason Lafredo, and we are once again acing Articulations. This is the third part of the Articulation Designer series, and we're talking specifically about positioning. Now, the one thing that's unique to Articulations in Finale in regards to positioning is that there is no global setting for articulation positioning. In fact, if you go to the document options, you won't see any pane for articulations. Um, and this is because articulations in Finale are very a la carte in their positioning. In other words, every single articulation is going to have its own set of positioning, and there's many options, and all of the articulations are need those options, and you'll see why as we get going. There is a way to globally or in a selection to move the articulations up, down, left, or right, or whatever you need, but there is no global setting for the position of articulation. All right. So let's look at some of this. Let's look at the accent, the articulation designer. What we're talking about here is the positioning, which is the bottom half of the window here. And there's sort of three modes of positioning, I guess you'd say. There's the vertical positioning, which has this pull-down menu, and there's 7 options. And this is related to the positioning of the articulation relative to the note head, the stem side, basically the up or down, whether it's on top or below the note. And there are sub-options for all of these options, which change and have different meaning depending on which setting you're using. The second mode, I guess, would be how the articulation interacts with slurs, and that's right here. There's a few options for that, which I'll show you as well. And then finally, there's the fine positioning, which will be handled in the handle positioning, as well as a distance from entry. And I'll show you that at the end of the video. All right. So let's get going with some of this vertical positioning. And actually, let me let me show you these options below, just in a general sense, so you can sort of get a handle of that first. So we have center horizontally, which will do exactly what it says. It will put the articulation, it'll center the articulation horizontally over the note. All right. So for example, our accent is set to center horizontally, and you'll see that I just put an accent on this F, and it is centered. Now, if I have that unchecked, the only thing you need to know about this is that it will depend on where your mouse is hovered over the note, where that articulation will get placed horizontally. So you see I was a little bit to the right, and the articulation got set further to the right. So it is important to know that that's what happens when that's unchecked. Most of the articulations here are set to be centered horizontally, so don't worry about it. There are a couple that are not, and there's a good reason for that, and I'll show you that when we get to them. Center over under stem when stem side. Now this is an option that was added not too long ago, I believe, specifically for the staccato articulation. Now it's unchecked for the accent, but if we look at the staccato, we will see that it is checked. And when that option is checked, you'll see that the staccato goes centered over the A there. But if we were go down here to this piano part and put some staccatos on this downstem second voice, you'll see what happens, that the staccato gets centered on the stem here as opposed to centered on the note head, right? Now this is an option that some people prefer, but if you would rather see it centered over the note, you can just uncheck that, and you'll see that the staccato marks are now a little bit right of the stem, but they're centered on the note head, right? This is sort of a choice that you can make, but by default that is checked for you with a staccato, all right? So that's what that does. The other options I wanted to look at below that were, if I get there, here we go. So my accent should be centered. Stack automatically, which we talked about in video, I think 13.2, when I talked about stacked articulations, so you can go back and look at that. Always place outside staff is, again, exactly what it sounds like. In the case of the accent, it is set to always place outside the staff, so no matter where the accent is, let me just show you this. I'll put it on all of these notes. No matter where it is, it will always be outside the staff. The one that's not set like that right currently is the staccato, which you'll see here, is unchecked, always place outside staff. And if I put staccatos on this whole measure, you'll see how that works. So some of these staccatos where there is room will actually be inside of the staff. And again, this is a personal choice. And I know that some people prefer to have all the staccatos outside the staff, so just check that option, and as you'll see, all of the staccatos will now be outside of the staff regardless of where the note is in the staff. Incidentally, if you do have this unchecked, always place outside staff, I would recommend having avoid staff lines checked, because if you uncheck that one as well, what you'll end up with a situation where sometimes the markings will actually kind of conflict with the staff lines, and that's not always a good look. So I'd recommend, if that's unchecked, to have that checked. All right. And then there are some other options here that are grayed out, and those are kind of specific to different settings here. So as we get to those settings, I'll talk about those options. All right. So let's talk about those settings, and I'm going to move over to page 2 here because I've got some new accents here. And basically what I did was I duplicated each accent, and I set each of these accents in these measures with these particular settings. So in this case, the always note head side accent is set to always note head side. All right. Now there are 7 options here. I'm going to ignore for the time being manual and on stem, because those are very specific positioning for certain articulations, and I'll get to those soon. But I'm going to talk about the other 5: auto note head stem side, always note head side, always stem side, above note, and below note. Now the last one here, auto note head stem side, this is what the normal accent is set to, and this is what a lot of the articulations are actually set to. So I'll show you that in a second. But the other options, this is what happens. Always note head side, it will put the accent always on the note head side. Doesn't matter which way the stem is flipped. In this case, the stem is flipped the wrong way, but it's still on the note head side, right? And you can see what happens when you have layers here. All of these accents down here, for example, are attached to layer 1, right? So they're kind of all out of place. Always stem side does the opposite. It will place it on the stem side no matter which way the stems are going, no matter what this layer situation is, we'll always place it on the stem side. Above note, in this case, it doesn't matter which way the stem goes, the accent will always go above the note. Sometimes it'll be on the note head side, sometimes it'll be on the stem side, right? And you can kind of see what that does to the layers situation here too. They all get put above, and there's lots of conflict, so that's not good for the accent anyway. And then finally, below note, same deal. Whether the stem is below or the note head is below, the accent will always go below. And then the same deal with the layers here, right? So obviously these first 4 are not going to be your ideal choices for the accent necessarily, but there are other uses for these 4 settings, just not the accent. The auto note head stem side is generally what you're going to want to use for an accent and for a lot of the other articulations that you would use. And so what this means by auto note head / stem side is that it will put the accent or whatever articulation note head first, unless the stem gets flipped for any reason. So in the case of the cello part here, I flipped it manually, and so the accent goes to the stem side as opposed to the note head side, right? And in the case of the layers, where they get flipped automatically due to the nature of how the layers behave, the accents get put on the stem side. So you can see that this is probably the most ideal result for your accent in this case, and it's set to auto note head stem side. There are uses for all these other 4, and I will get to those currently. So let's look at, let's see, we talked about, so auto note head stem side, so you know what that is, right? So let's talk about always note head side. Now, obviously with the accent, that's not going to be useful, but there are certain articulations where it is useful, and specifically the parentheses use that setting. So I've got 2 parentheses, a left and a right parentheses here set up, and you can see that the articulation designer has it set to always note head side, right? And when we use those articulations, you'll see on this note here that it places the articulation to the left and to the right of the note head there, right? And it doesn't matter which way the stem is going. We'll always place it next to the note, or note head side, right, as it suggests. And the difference here is that, obviously this would be the same result if this was set up to be auto note head stem side, right? Because without any flippage going on, it's always going to be here. But if the notes get flipped, like in the case of here, go to layer 2 here and put these articulations. Actually, I know what the 9 and 0, right? 9 and 0. Yeah, you can see that it's still on the note head. So regardless of whether or not they're flipped, it's always on the note head side, right? And one interesting thing to note about this particular articulation is that it does say it's centered horizontally, but obviously those articulations are not centered horizontally over the note, right? Essentially what's going on here is there is an offset set in the handle positioning over here that is setting the left bracket in this case to the left of the center. If you had this unchecked, again, like I mentioned before, it depends on where you click. So the offset's going to be from where you click. But in this case, we want to kind of rigidly set. It's set from the center, offset this much. And the same with the right bracket. It's set in the center and then offset to the right. So that's why this center horizontally is checked. It's because there's an offset to the left over here. All right. So that's note head side. There aren't too many examples in the articulation library that use note head side besides that, but that's one great use of that. As far as stem side goes, there's nothing in this library that uses the stem side positioning. And I was trying to think of a reason that you might use an articulation that always gets placed on the stem side. And maybe the only thing I can think of is if you have some sort of special character that goes on the end of a stem or something for some other for some special musical notation, you might want to use that always stem side option. But there's nothing in the default set that uses stem side. All right. There's a lot that uses the above note setting. For example, the trill, you'll see is set to above note. The fermata is set to above note. And again, this means that it will set the articulation above the note regardless of whether or not the stem goes up or down, right? So if I were to set the trill here, you'd see it's above. Here, you'd see it's still above, right? Doesn't matter where that trill goes, it's always going to be above. However, there's one sub-option that becomes available when you have the above note vertical positioning selected, and that's the very last one, which is place stem side when multiple layers are present, right? So only when multiple layers are present and you have a and you place that trill, it's going to go stem side. Now when on the layer 1, obviously stem side is going to be above, so that's correct, right? But in layer 2 here, it's going to go below, right? So if I were to uncheck that, it would ignore the multiple layers and still put it above, which might not be what you want in this particular case, right? So there's that one sub option available only when above note is selected, right? And then finally below note, we have that setting as well. And below note will primarily be used for things like the pedal marking, and you can see that it will always go below, and it's set to below note. And again, with the pedal marking specifically, these are legitimately good options to have set. You always want it centered, you always want it stacked, you always want it outside the staff, right? So that's why those would be checked for the pedal mark. And I don't think there's, other than the pedal mark and the release mark that goes along with it, I don't know that there's any other ones that are currently set to below note. But you could, if you want, again, if you wanted to have some fingering that was always below the notes, regardless of stem direction, you could set up a new set of fingerings for that, okay? Oh, one other thing I wanted to show you about the above note. There isn't a, there's a certain thing I was thinking about that would be handy for that above note positioning. So let me just do something here. I'm going to duplicate the trill, because that uses the above note positioning. And in the font set, there are a series of accidentals that have parentheses around them. So you could actually change the character to something like that and use that as, I guess, an editorial accent, right? So that's another great use for the above note setting. And again, it would, if the stem is going up, it would still be above the note, right? So one more use for the above note setting. All right, so that's above note, below note, good. So let's talk about manual and on stem. Now, manual has a very specific use, mainly for the roll, and it's this articulation right here. And if we edit that, you'll see that we have manual selected. Now, what's interesting about this is that another option becomes available, attached to top note, In this case, it's unchecked, but we could check that if we wanted to. I wouldn't recommend doing that. And above that, we also get this option, copy main symbol, which becomes available. Any other one that disappears, but if we go to manual, you see that becomes available, and we have two options, vertically or horizontally. Now, in the case of the roll, we want to copy it vertically. So basically what Finale is doing is it's using this character right here from the font set, which is sort of this vertical squiggly line, except it's only like one or two squiggles, right? But that's not necessarily how a roll would work. See how long it is? So again, with that option checked, we get the ability to extend it up and down, right? So that would be basically one symbol. And then when we extend it, we're basically extending it so that it gets copied, right? So that's 2, 3, oops, getting a little, 4, 5. You got to be careful because you can get a little horizontal with it too. All right, so essentially that's what it's doing. It's copying the symbol vertically. There is one symbol in here that does use the copy horizontal, and I'll show you that right now. And it is, where is it? Ah, right here. This symbol will use the copy main symbol horizontally, and in this case it's always placed outside the staff. Again, set to manual. And with this symbol we can actually put that in place and extend it, right? So this would be sort of a trill extension line that we can use. Now, I'm gonna stop here and caution you, because if you're gonna create this particular notation, I would strongly recommend that you do it with the Smart Shape tool instead. There is a trill in the Smart Shape that will do exactly this. So if I were to enter it here, you could see exactly the same thing. And the advantage of using this versus advantage of using a Smart Shape versus an articulation is that this trill in the Smart Shape has end points and beginning points, which means that when the measure gets wider or narrower, the line will extend or contract, right? So again, you know, if we were to, oops, let's see, sorry. If we were to put a whole bunch of measures up there, you'll see what happens. With the trill line, the Smart Shape will get contracted so that it fits, but this one will be way too long, right? Because it's a fixed length, essentially, is what's happening. Again, so just don't, I wouldn't use the articulation for this particular application, but that is there if you want to use something that copies horizontally. That would be the use for that, okay? And finally, let's talk about the on-stem position. And the on-stem position is very specific to the tremolo articulations, these three right here, and there's a Z here that goes on the stem as well. And you'll see that the on-stem is selected. And with the on-stem vertical positioning, you'll notice that all of the options get grayed out because they don't really mean anything. Except, this is what I find odd, the center horizontally and center over under stem when stem side is checked, but they're grayed out. And I did some digging into this. It turns out that if, for whatever reason, you change this and then uncheck these and then change it back, it will screw up the positioning of the tremolo. So this is kind of only relevant if you ever create an articulation from scratch that needs to be on stem. You just got to make sure that those two options are checked. Otherwise, it's not actually going to be centered on the stem. It's an oddity. I don't know why that gets grayed out when this is selected, but that's what happens. All right. The other interesting thing to know about on stem is that any other setting will have in the right hand side distance from entry here, which has to do with the distance between the articulation and the note or the rest. With on stem, that changes to on stem distance from note head, and the second option becomes available, on stem distance from stem end flag beam. These two entries are putting padding between, in this case, one side of the articulation and the note head, and the other side of the articulation and the end of the stem, the flag, or the beam, right? So there's a little bit of padding between, right? So these numbers will change that amount of padding, right? If you think there's too little or too much with that. And also with the on stem, as I've mentioned a couple times before, the this will actually move the stem and beam to allow that padding to occur, right? So if we delete that, you'll see that the stem gets shortened. When we add it, it gets extended, okay? So that's the on-stem positioning. Yeah, I was just checking to see if there's anything else I want to say about that, but there is not. All right. So that is on stem. So that's basically all 7 of those positionings, okay? So let's talk about slur interaction. Now, let me show you the accent edit. In the upper right-hand corner of the bottom portion, we have slur interaction. There's 3 options: ignore, always inside, and auto inside outside. Now, in the case of the accent, it's set to auto inside outside. And what this means is that the accent will go inside the slur if there's room. If there's no room, it will go outside the slur, right? And in the case of the last note here, you'll see that it goes outside because there's no room between the end of the slur and the note, right? Same thing on this first note, obviously. Well, it's going to go below, so it doesn't matter. The second to last note is also going to go above because there's just not enough room. But this third to last note will go underneath because there's actually a little bit of room, right? And in fact, all of these notes will go underneath, right? So that's what this auto inside setting is doing. And interestingly, if you actually change the position of the end of the slur, those accents will adjust dynamically. So if I were to move this up just a little bit, you'll see that second to last one flip inside because now there's room underneath between the slur and the note. And if I keep going, that last one will also get put underneath, right? And actually, you can go the other way too. If I just keep going down, you'll see them all flip to the top, which is kind of handy. It's a nice little feature that is sort of automatic avoidance of the articulation and the slur. I'm just going to reset this back to its normal position. Hold on. Remove manual slur adjustments. Thank you. And the other setting there is for used a lot for the staccatos and a few other articulations, which is always inside. So now this will basically move the slur out of the way. So you notice that now there's room for that staccato right there, right? If I were to remove that, you'll see that slur, the end of that slur go down a little bit, just like that, right? So that setting will actually move the slur itself to make room for the articulation. You'll see how some of these articulations are set. Like a lot of these are set mostly to be, well, that one's always inside. We got always inside there. Let's see. A lot of these are, there we go, auto inside for that articulation. The accent is auto inside outside. All those accents are like that, right? So there are some there's some different settings, and if you don't like it, you can change that. And then obviously ignore will do just that. It will ignore it. So if I were to use that staccato again and just press ignore, choose the ignore option, you'll see that now the slur kind of like runs into that staccato, which is not a great thing. So it's helpful for that staccato to be always inside. All right, so that is slur interaction. And finally, let's talk about handle positioning. Now, handle positioning, I believe, is sort of misnamed. I guess it makes sense, but you kind of have to understand what's going on with articulations and fonts and everything. Basically, an articulation is a character from a font, right? And I don't know a ton about font annotations, but I do know that there's a bounding rectangle around every font character, and somewhere in that rectangle there's an attachment point or a handle, which tells the program to put the character in a specific position. So the handle positioning is essentially what this allows you to do is to offset from that handle positioning within the bounding rectangle. It's very technical, but the bottom line is, and what this means for us as engravers and whatnot, is that this will allow us to fine-tune the adjustment of where the articulation exists. And when you open this box, you get offset from handle, the main symbol and flip symbol, and there's a horizontal and vertical options for both. And depending on what value you put in here, it will move the articulation left or right. So in horizontal, a positive number will go right, a negative number will go left. In vertical, a negative number will go down, a positive number will go up. And basically, it will move that articulation, that amount of value, away from the handle position, which is somewhat arbitrary for our purposes, but it's not completely arbitrary. There is an actual, position of it that makes sense to the computer, I suppose. But this is how we would adjust it. So all this is to say, so for example, if we put an accent on this, actually, let me do it over here. If we put an accent on this D, the other thing to know about this is that the handle position will vary depending on whether or not, in this case, let me just zoom in a little bit. In this case, whether or not the handle position is relative to the top staff line in this case because it's above the staff, or in the case of over here, the top note, right? Because now it's above the note. So there's a handle position somewhere over here that it's attaching to where the note is, the bounding rectangle of the note, and also where something relative to the staff line, right? And as far as the handle positioning is concerned, if, for some reason, if we look at this and we say, I think this is too close to the staff, then all we have to do is go here and change the vertical. It's set to a negative number right now, but if we just change this to a positive number, it will go up a little bit. So we can say, let's say negative 0.025, let's say. And you should see that that accent gets a little bit further higher. Actually, let me put a big value there so you can really see it, 0.5. You see how high it gets, right? So again, that's a way to fine tune if you think if it's too close. Now, what was that? Negative 0.01. And same thing with the vertical. This could be handy if you're using a character from a font that that may be unique. Maybe the rectangle is not exactly where it should be, and it's not quite centering on the note head. You might need to make some fine adjustments to this horizontal value. Okay, so in this case, we could say 0.3, and you'll watch that accent go way to the right, right? So that's sort of what that does. And please excuse this very abrupt and rude edit, but the video is going so well, and I just wanted to fix this one section because what I had said originally made absolutely no sense. So I'll give it another shot. I'm talking about distance from entry, which is this value below the handle positioning. And this is pretty much what it sounds like. This is a distance that the articulation is from the entry. Now, entry can be either a note, a rest, or another articulation. And the distance will be, if the articulation is above the note, the distance will go upwards. If the articulation is below the note, the distance will go downwards, right? Because it's a distance away from the entry. In the case of stacked articulations, it will be the distance away from the next articulation closer to the note, right? If that makes sense. So if the stack's going upwards, this will be the distance away from the articulation that's directly below it, okay? And what's happening here with this distance from entry is that this value is telling Finale where to place the handle, which is connected to that invisible bounding rectangle that I talked about in your character. It's telling Finale where to place that handle. And then you can use the handle positioning offsets to further change the vertical positioning from there. So actually, these offsets will actually add or subtract to this distance from entry, if that makes sense. There's some implications for this, which I'll explain in a second. But I just wanted to show you what would happen. We have a value of 0.04 on this accent. If I were to change this to 0.05, you'll see that or just 0.4, you'll see that the accent gets way up there. And the same thing will happen on a note below, right? Let's see. Yeah, it's so far down it actually got covered up by the chord down here, but there it is. So that value is really, obviously too high for something like that. But this is a good place if you think that the value that you have right here is, if you think that accent's a little bit too far, you can adjust this a little bit. Make that 0.03, and it will get just a little bit closer to the note. Okay. So that's essentially what that does. Now, there is a special situation where when you have articulations that are set to always place outside staff, like we do right here, all right, there's something that happens here because sometimes, and in this case, this is another case, but let me actually make this a little bit more so if we move this note down a little bit. you can see that now the distance between the entry, the note in this case, and the articulation is likely very far exceeds the distance from entry, right? Because obviously 0.04 would probably put the accent somewhere around here, and clearly placing it outside the staff places it outside that distance, right? So once that happens, essentially the handle gets moved from being away from the entry, and it gets moved to a position on top of the staff in this case, or below if the accent's below, right? So now the only way to move this accent up or down relative to the top staff line is to use the handle positioning, right? And we've established that we can change the vertical like this, but if I were to change this value from negative 0.01 to, say, positive 0.02, you'll see that this accent is going to get a little bit further away from the staff, all right? And so that's a way to, that would be sort of the only way to change the distance from an articulation away from the staff in the case of an articulation always being placed outside of the staff. So clear as mud, and back to our regularly scheduled program. The final thing I want to talk about is there is a setting to adjust how far away the articulations are when slur avoidance is selected. Now, I just put some accents here, and you'll notice that they're a certain distance away from the slur, right? There is no setting in the articulations to adjust this particular positioning, but that adjustment does exist in the Smart Shape tool, in the Smart Shape menu, Smart Slur Options. In the upper right, there is an option for slur avoidance, articulations avoided slurs by, and now there's a value here, which is going to be the minimum value that the articulation is going to get away from that slur. So if we were to, do something silly by making this a negative number, you should actually see that those articulations will now kind of, either go underneath and not avoid the slur, or in this case, it's actually crossing that slur, right? So that would be where you'd want to change that value. And in fact, if we make that a bigger value, 0.5, right? Is that right? 0.05? Yeah. You'll see they get farther away. An even bigger value. Let's make it 0.2. And you'll see that not only is it putting it farther away, but it's changing the which accents will get placed outside based on that avoidance number, right? Even the accent here, where there's plenty of room, it's actually not plenty of room based on that value of avoidance, right? So if we go back and change that back to something more reasonable, 0.02, you'll see that all sort of go back to normal. All right. So it is if you're looking to adjust that positioning away from the slur in the slur avoidance, that's where that can be found. It's in the Smart Shape, Smart Slur Options. All right. So wow, that is a lot. I told you the positioning is a little bit complicated in articulations. I hope I've done a decent job explaining it all. All this is to say is that there's not a whole lot you normally need to do with the positioning of articulations, but now that you kind of have a grasp of the basic concepts of it, I think if there's some fine tuning you want to make, or some adjustments you want to make, otherwise, you should be able to have a good grasp of how to do that now. All right, so thanks for watching. This has been the Articulation Designer, and come back. We'll do, I think, maybe one more video on articulations. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.